Stephen Meyer, the director of the Discovery Institute and professional liar. A lot of you who watch my stuff, you probably know about Professor Dave's takedown of everybody that works for the Discovery Institute, including Stephen Meyer. So I'm not going to try to replicate and focus on the things that Dave does. He's way better at it than I am. But if you don't know what I'm talking about, you should watch that material. The thing with Stephen Meyer is he's extremely smart. He knows quite a lot of things, but he constructs straw man arguments, and he just flat out says things that aren't true all the time. He just lies about... He invents these controversies by making up context and lies about things that never actually happened, or just misrepresenting the science behind things in order to make a cheap point. I would say the slimiest thing he does, which is really weird, is he doesn't own up to what he is. He's a young Earth creationist, but if you saw his Joe Rogan episode, I haven't watched more than a couple minutes of this, so I don't know if he'll get into it, but he doesn't let you know that he's a young Earth creationist, and that's a tactic. It's deliberate. In fact, he talks about everything we know about biology from, like, in the context of what non-creationist evolutionary biologists say. He talks about the Cambrian explosion and how it was hundreds of millions of years ago, and he talks about the emergence of species in the fossil record. He says everything as though Earth is very old, and the fossil record exactly is or is structured like what geologists, paleontologists, and evolutionary biologists tell you it is. And then he just interjects all this doubt, and that's just to undermine the current scientific paradigms. He's also the architect of the Wedge document, which is literally a conspiracy theory to try to undermine traditional secular science and promote Christianity by pretending that intelligent design is science. It's really, really hard to catch his lies, because he'll talk about something that's kind of obscure, or he has ways of framing things in very reasonable sounding ways, and he'll say many things that are true, and then he'll say, and biologists cannot come up with, or he'll at the very end he'll just say something flat out not true at all. So hopefully we'll be able to spot a couple of those. I'll tell you what he's actually doing, and we'll have fun with it. Funny enough, what Pierce does is he shows Tucker, who, that was my last video, so we don't need to go over that again, but he shows Stephen what Tucker said, and then we get Stephen's reaction.
In what sense?
Okay.
Your response?
Well, I don't know what Tucker knows about all this, but
probably not as qualified as you. But he likes to.
Maybe we'll start with something that happened here in
Oh God, Pierce, just lick his boot even more.
London a few years ago, 2016, major conference convened by the Royal Society, arguably the world's most august and prestigious scientific body, was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who are dissatisfied with the standard neo-Darwinian theory of evolution. And
so far, this is kind of true.
Many of the conveners are calling for a new theory, because the primary mechanism of biological change articulated by Darwin and his subsequent followers, now called the neo-Darwinists, the idea of natural selection acting on random mutations and variations, is now understood to lack the creative power to generate major changes in the history of life.
Okay, so that's sort of true, but again, I think he's being a little bit deceitful. He's 100% correct. There was a meeting. Actually, the whole thing was recorded. You can watch the videos somewhere. But what Stephen is talking about is exactly what he talked about when he was on Joe Rogan's podcast. And genetically modified skeptic and stated casually, I can't remember his real name. Sorry if you are watching this, which he's not, but whatever. I think it's John Perry. He does an extremely good job of laying out what was actually talked about at that conference and how Stephen just isn't representing it properly. The main gripe that was brought up at that conference was that evolutionary biologists are sort of dissatisfied with how the gene has taken center stage, and like some of them are concerned that way too much of the research and the thought experiments that go into how we think about and research evolution is too gene-centered, and we may have blinders on toward other things. That is an extremely responsible and typical scientific attitude. A scientist should be dogmatic and open. Now, you may think that those two things can't really be the case, but being dogmatic just means that you gauge like alternative beliefs as being less likely to be true. That's really all that dogmatic means. And for a scientist, at least in the face of something so obviously stupid like young Earth creationism, yeah, we are dogmatic. But the reason we are dogmatic is because the scientific process gives us extremely well-justified reasons to be dogmatic, because it's predicated on evidence, experiments, observations, and predictions that have come true. However, scientists are open, which means they are open to the possibility that an alternative explanation may be the correct one. So, for example, I don't know, like geologists in the early 1900s thought that the Earth was at least many millions of years old, but they did not think that the lithosphere, that the surface of Earth, moved around. And they did not believe Alfred Wegener's hypothesis. And, you know, he had some shortcomings, to be fair, but his evidence was actually very solid. But then later, when evidence was produced, when the ocean floor was mapped, and we could actually see the breaks in Earth's surface, geologists very quickly were like, holy shit. That's the only example off the top of my head I can think of like being dogmatic and open at the same time. What this scientist, and I don't remember which one it was, but at the conference, he proposed that we rename the like current scientific model or theory for evolution the extended evolutionary synthesis. Because Darwin was a product of his time and the technology of his time, his original theory doesn't really have a huge amount of, it doesn't have that wide of a scope. And then what we typically talk about, and I usually talk about it, the modern synthesis, that's just basically combining genes with, you know, traditional evolution and selection and all of those things. But we now know of a huge number of different factors that are extremely important that aren't really about the genes necessarily, or these other things like niche construction. So that is where like a beaver builds a dam, and that by the beaver building the dam, that actually creates a niche because they create artificial lakes. And that has huge, I mean, you completely change an ecosystem when you add beavers because of that. And if beavers go away from your ecosystem, then that further alters it. It regresses back to, you know, whatever it was before there were beavers and all that standing water. I don't actually have any idea what plasticity and evolvability are. I don't actually do this for a living. I try to read a lot of books about this, and I try to keep up. But this Evo-Devo embryology thing, this was the main focus of that conference. They thought that there are lots of changes that go on during embryology that can account for a lot of things that if you're just looking at it from a gene perspective, you would throw your hands up and be like, well, that could have never been selected for, or that's too preposterous to propose that happening. And we know through experiments that subtle changes in gene expression during embryology can have dramatic effects. One of the examples that Perry goes over here is with cats. So some domesticated cats are born with a fully functioning and fully formed extra digit instead of that little like thumb claw that they have. If my cat was in here right now, I would grab her and show you. But this just comes from Hox genes, I believe it's Hox genes, being left on for slightly longer and then overexpressing that part. Again, this is something we've kind of known about for a long time. It's just a matter of putting it all together. Now, what Meyer does not do is he tells you he does tell you that the scientists are dissatisfied, as if to say scientists have realized that their theory is inadequate and now they don't know what to do. No, we know very clearly, we know what natural selection and a traditional view of like selection and genes and variants does not account for. We know what that is, and we know what does account for it. It just hasn't been properly put into like a unifying theory. But again, he doesn't tell you that, as if to say that now evolutionary biologists themselves are doubting their own idea.
Is the crux of this debate, is it, as Tucker was getting at there, is it that if you actually start from where Darwin's theory begins, the creation of the human being was so complicated, the body, the way we exist is so complicated, it doesn't make any rational sense.
There's two issues, really. There's how do you...
Okay, I don't know what he's going to say to that, but in response, Pierce is just imagining that, like, yes, of course, a fully formed human wouldn't spontaneously evolve. That doesn't make any sense. But that's not how evolution works. It's all in gradual steps. And I see nothing about the human being that no feature of the human being or the organism at large that could not have gradually appeared. We know, so like the human eye, for example, it's a compound eye. It's got many parts, perhaps, whatever. But we know eyes have evolved multiple times, at least 40 times in the animal kingdom. So obviously some sort of way to see, and many of those eyes are extremely simple and some are slightly more complex just through small changes. Darwin actually previewed this in his very first edition of On the Origin of Species, and you can look up great examples of it in textbooks as well. You'll also hear people say these are sort of almost irreducible complexity arguments, but things like humans can't exist without the gut bacteria, but the gut bacteria only live in humans, so they could not have spontaneously evolved. And it's like, so if we don't have gut bacteria, or if we have different types of gut bacteria, then the reason it doesn't work is because of our diets. Well, what if our diets are slightly different and the diets only change after the introduction of gut bacteria? But it's not like gut bacteria are something that only humans have. That's widespread in the animal world.
You get to the first life from the simpler non-living chemicals. That's sometimes called chemical evolutionary theory, and that's a complete mess. It's in a state of impasse, and almost everyone, even your recent guest.
No, it is not in a state of impasse. Scientists have not thrown up their hands and given up, and that's kind of what he's saying. We don't have any theories for origin of life. We have many hypotheses: RNA world, amyloid world hypothesis. I'm not particularly well versed in them. There's a really great modern day debate with I don't know who the guy is, but he's been on there several times, and this total idiot, this chick Taylor is her name, who is debating against it. He does a very good job of explaining all this. I'm not really qualified to do it, but I can give you sources to go look at.
Richard Dawkins acknowledges we have no chemical evolutionary theory that accounts for the origin of the first life. And many people don't know that Darwin didn't attempt to explain the origin of the first life. Rather, he presumed one or very few simple organisms, which we now know were not simple, and then proposed a mechanism by which you could generate all the new forms of life we see on the planet today.
So the alternative there would have to be some form of an argument from incredulity or an argument from ignorance or whatever. We don't know how this happened, therefore my creator is the best explanation. That's not evidence of your creator. That is just like you don't get points. If you have an idea and then somebody else has a different idea, you don't score points when they don't produce anything. That's like imagining if I'm playing basketball and the other team never scores, I win. It's like maybe baseball's a better analogy because there are a lot of, or soccer, because there are a lot of 0-0 matches, right? Like, no, you don't win if your opponent doesn't score. You have to. But I always argue that we don't need to know. You don't need to know where something came from to have good confidence in some idea about it. So no, we don't know where life came from. But is life in any way miraculous? No. every time a cell copies its DNA, does a miracle occur? Absolutely not. No, it doesn't. Nothing that a living organism does is miraculous. And what is life? This comes up in my debates a lot when I talk about this. I ask people to even tell me what life is, and they never can. They give me the characteristics of life. Life is made of cells, therefore life had to always have been made of cells, and the cell could not have spontaneously evolved, therefore so on and so forth. Life has DNA, life takes in energy and nutrients, all those things. Those are characteristics of life. That's the equivalent of if I ask you what is a car and you say car go vroom, that is not what a car is. The best definition for life, the one I like the most, is NASA's, which is a self-replicating chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. So life is literally merely chemistry. So it could non-life have produced life? Well, life isn't this, I mean, if we want to be like totally absurd about this, life isn't this separate thing that, I don't know, that operates according to completely different laws of physics or something weird like that. It is literally just a product of chemistry. Look into the cell. You wouldn't call a single chemical reaction or even a group of hundreds of chemical reactions that occur in a cell. You wouldn't say that those chemical reactions are life, but life emerges out of them. So I think I use this line in my book. Why would we assume that the origin of something would be completely different from its operation? So if life operates according to mere physical chemistry, then I think that's actually an excellent explanation for where it came from. And that's what it looks like. You know, I mean, not just because the cell is merely powered by chemistry, but we can do analogous things in the lab. We can create molecules that are autocatalytic. They speed up, they replicate themselves and speed up their own replication process, and we can make them compete against each other. Now it never goes on like into perpetuity because you don't have like a real metabolism or anything there, but it's just a proof of concept that molecules can do the kinds of things that life does. Now imagine a planet with vast surface area, with huge numbers of hydrothermal vents or whatever, and literally trillions of chemical reactions occurring per cubic centimeter across that vast planet over the course of tens or hundreds of millions of years. And the idea that eventually something like life popped up is not too fantastical to believe in. Not at all. But a literal miracle performed by a literal magical being is way too fantastical to believe in. And it's unsupportable. There's no evidence for it. The best you can do is say, yeah, well, you don't know what, or you can't show me when your idea happened or where it happened or how it happened. Therefore, my idea scores points. We already went over that. That's not how that works.
Many people don't know that Darwin didn't attempt to explain the origin of the first life. Rather, he presumed one or very few simple organisms, which we now know were not simple, and then proposed a mechanism by which you could generate all the new forms of life we see on the planet today. But even that now is being challenged because the main mechanism of evolutionary change does a nice job of explaining small-scale variation. What Tucker was referring to, I think, is adaptation. This would be examples like Darwin's finches, where the beaks get a little bigger, a little smaller in response to varying weather patterns. But it does a very poor job of explaining the major innovations in the history of life, such as the origin of birds or mammals or animals in the first place. And there,
complete bullshit. I don't know if he'll get into this, but he does this thing where, and all the creationists do this. I hate to keep saying this, but I talk about this in my book, where they talk about the idea that evolution cannot create new genetic material, and that we have known that that's not true for half a century. Yeah, like since the 70s or whatever. We know that point mutations can have dramatic effects on a gene. It can completely change what the gene does. And we know that genes can get duplicated. And at first, a duplicated gene is just an extra copy of something that was already there. But that duplicated gene can become mutated, and then that adds extra function. Part of what makes this really tricky to like, I can see how even somebody that believes in evolution thinks about these things and then just goes, yeah, that does seem like it falls short. It does sound like it, but I think a big part of that is we assume that there's a one-to-one gene function correspondence. That is absolutely not the case. It is the case for some things, but the vast majority of all the characteristics that any living thing has is polygenic. It's the result of many, many genes working together. It might be easier to just think of a bacteria. Bacteria don't really have phenotypes or traits. They have functions, they do things. Probably the biggest thing about them is their metabolism, right? And metabolism is a symphony of all kinds of different genes being activated and deactivated and having their timing varied in order to accomplish certain tasks. Now, we are like that. For example, human height, there is no gene for it. The most significant, in Robert Sapolsky's book, Behave, he goes over this, and it's really fascinating. I don't remember exactly, but they were able to find at least many hundreds. It may have been over 1,000 genes that have something to do with height. And the one that had the greatest statistical significance accounted for something like 1/200th of the difference in height between people. So there's no gene for that. So anyways, why I bring that up is because these simple point mutations or gene duplications, and then a duplicated gene being slightly mutated, you can't predict exactly what effect that'll have, but it can have effects that reverberate across a huge span of the genome, and that can obviously have massive effects for the organism as a whole. Richard Lenski, his long-term E. coli experiment, they've seen fascinating things, such as the ability for the E. coli to metabolize citrate. It's either in the presence or absence of oxygen. I don't remember which one. And that came about through multiple gene duplications in its genome that now gave it a function that it didn't previously have. Or what they would say is, well, it could already do that. This just enhanced it, so it's still not new, whatever. A different example, I don't remember who did this experiment, but they took E. coli and they deleted the gene for metabolizing lactose. Bacteria were able to spontaneously re-evolve the ability to metabolize lactose, not by gaining back the gene that was deleted, but by subtle changes, none of which is a mutation for metabolizing lactose or anything like that. But the interaction of all those genes working together created a metabolic pathway for them. So no, this is not an example of a reptile, a dinosaur turning into a bird, but it's a proof of concept. And evolution proposes that these things happen incrementally. What I never really thought of until I read it from the Counter-Creationist Handbook was, like, if we saw examples of organisms just turning into other types of organisms in one generation or a few generations, that would actually, in a huge way, disprove evolution, because there'd be nothing about what we currently understand about biology that would be able to make sense of that. That would be magical, or it would just be some completely different non-magical physical process that we know nothing about, that definitely isn't like neo-Darwinian evolution or whatever. And he's just completely leaving out the fact that we have excellent transitional fossils of birds, such as Archaeopteryx and Hesperornis, and many others.
In the fossil record, we do see many instances of very abrupt appearance without the transitional intermediates that you'd expect on the basis of the Darwinian picture of the tree of life.
I talked about this in the last video. I'll be really brief. We will never, nor would it be responsible or intellectually honest to assume that we have the complete record of every single form of life on our planet. But you only need one for the proof of concept. Archaeopteryx is all the... It really... I mean, I feel like I almost shouldn't say this, but it's true. That's all we needed to confirm the idea that that birds are the descendants of dinosaurs. Now, again, we shouldn't be satisfied with just that, but we have huge numbers of these in the fossil record. The transitional fossils for horses are extremely good. The transitional fossils for whales are extremely good. The only thing these people can do is say, well, those are fully formed organisms. Every single organism is a fully formed organism. So really, by making that argument, you're really saying that a transitional fossil can't exist. And that's obviously stupid and completely dishonest. Once again, in the book, I go over in pretty rich detail. I really pick out the horse and whale fossils, how we know that these are transitional fossils. So, for example, with the whales, we have that astragalus bone in the foot where it has two like pulley notches in it, and Pachycetus, Ambulocetus, and I believe Basilosaurus have those. And people look at Ambulocetus and it's easy to think that that's not a whale, but you can't look at Basilosaurus and not think that that is a whale. Yet it has hind limbs, like fully developed but non-functional ones. We call that like an exaptation, where an organ starts to have a completely different function than what it started with. Here's the Basilosaurus hind limb, and you have to kind of look at the whole animal to really get an appreciation for it. But obviously those hind limbs would have been useless for any kind of locomotion. But notice how they have the exact same bone structure that walking limbs would have. So anyways, that astragalus bone is located on the Basilosaurus and the Ambulocetus, and I think Dorudon as well. But it's completely absent in modern whales, but nobody would look at a Basilosaurus and not think that that is a whale. Well, the only other animals that have that type of astragalus bone are the ungulates, the hoofed animals. And we know through genetic testing that whales are most closely related to the odd-toed ones. I always forget if that's artiodactyl or perissodactyl, but the most closely related to hippos. So the fossil record informs you of relationships between completely different groups of animals. So, for example, with the whales, it's the ungulates and the cetaceans. Now, on the surface, that seems completely absurd. But what we can do then, we don't just rely on the fossil record. We look to genetics, and genetics confirmed exactly what the fossil record predicted. Another thing I want to show you is the Basilosaurus skull. So again, for the zillionth time, I talk about this in the book. But Basilosaurus, unlike modern whales, has heterodonty, different types of teeth. Whales today have homodonty. The ones with like conical teeth, like sperm whales and orcas and whatever else. All of their teeth are exactly the same. And then baleen whales, I mean, they don't even have teeth, but whatever. But mammals, typically, we have that. This is a major defining characteristic of mammals, is that we have different types of teeth. So we have incisors and canines and bicuspids and molars and all of that. But if we look at Basilosaurus, you can very plainly see, let me make this image bigger for you actually, that the back teeth, they're very oddly shaped, but they're completely different from the front teeth. And what do you know? Ambulocetus has that exact same thing. It's harder to see, but those weird, like, I don't know what you call this, not like fan-shaped, but these weird triangular rear teeth with like multiple points on them. This isn't the greatest picture of an Ambulocetus skull, but it has those exact same tooth structures in there. So you either have to believe this is the wildest coincidence in history, or evolution actually does make sense.
Is your belief that the Darwin theory actually fails then?
I think it does fail. I think it captures an element of the truth. The small-scale microevolutionary variation is certainly a real process, and no one disputes that. Natural selection is a real process, but what's at issue now is the degree to which it has genuine creative power. And I think at this 2016 conference, the opening talk was given by a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, not an American talk show host, and he enumerated 5 major explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism, many of them surrounding this problem that the mechanism lacks the generative or creative power necessary to account for the major innovations in the history of life.
Yeah, again, so that's not to say that scientists are clueless where that can come from, and I've already gone over this. We've known for a long time how to create new genetic material that can lead to new changes.
Well, your best-selling book, new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, you argue there are 3 big scientific discoveries that point to the existence of God. I want to go through these. One, the Big Bang Theory. So why would that lend support to a theory of a God?
Okay, so let me front load this with the way I usually talk about this is you cannot have scientific evidence for a God. It makes absolutely no sense. The best attempts at this are I've heard some people talk about how the universe seems to have, and these are only good arguments because it's really hard to figure out what they're talking about, but something about like something we understand about quantum physics or whatever, and the way the universe really works at a fundamental level shows us that there are like observations or whatever are like mind dependent. So that means that the universe, I don't know if it works like a mind or therefore must be like the product of a mind. And then that would be God. That's just hard to respond to. I would like to get a physicist to react to that. I've actually shown that argument to Blitz before. I don't really remember what he said about it. But all these other ones are, you cannot scientifically explain miraculous events going on. You just can't. I can get how that can seem like a cheap rhetorical trick from people on my side, where we're just saying, it sounds like the equivalent of when evolution deniers say there is no evidence of evolution and you'll never find any because there can't be. But this is different. A God does not do its works by the known laws of nature, right? So it is literally whatever a God does is completely unintelligible. So I usually say to people like, we have laws of motion. We can describe how things fall and what their trajectories are and how they fly through the air and all of those things. And what a flat earther would say is a helium balloon disproves gravity, right? Except no, we can actually understand atmospheric pressure and buoyancy and how that would make the helium balloon go up, how it is lighter than air. Now, imagine a world where magic is real and you wave your wand and you make something float up in the air. Could you ever scientifically describe what is going on? Obviously not. There is no naturalistic explanation that tells you what is going on. There's no equation that says, oh, if you use this much magic, you can levitate this much material. Or if your midichlorian count is this high, then you can lift the X-Wing out of the swamp, or whatever. That's never going to happen. The only thing you could possibly do is throw your hands up and give up and say, I don't know what's going on, but then you're just arguing from ignorance and incredulity once again. Another problem I have with this is people say things like, a universe, like science proves God because a God would want to have a relationship with us and create a universe that can be understood by humans. And so by understanding nature, we're better understanding God's creation, so on and so forth. That's cute, but what you have to do with that is you have to be the one assuming the mind of God. And I think that totally makes sense in terms of the way these people think, because they try to anthropomorphize everything, and we created God in our own image. It's weird how God is so much like a person in so many ways. But if it's so frustrating and dumb and kind of precious and cute. How when you talk to these people about like the logical problems with God or whatever, they just say God is beyond logic. God is beyond nature. God is beyond our comprehension. When you back them into a corner, they just say that as if that actually helps their case in any way. But that's just them saying, I don't have to answer these questions because it's God. Yet you're going to tell me what God's intentions are and why God, like you somehow know what kind of universe a God would create. I don't think you can be more arrogant than that. I really don't. Okay, let's see what he has to say about the Big Bang.
Well, right. Maybe just a little framing before I dive into the evidence. Professor Dawkins at Oxford has said that the universe has precisely the properties that we should expect if at bottom there is no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
Yep.
And though I'm on the opposite side of this science v. God issue with the good professor, I think he does a marvelous job of framing key issues. And this is one of those great framing quotations. Because what he's saying is that whether we think of it as a scientific question or a philosophical question or both, if we have a hypothesis about reality, the way we test that is by looking at the world around us and seeing if what we see comports with what we would expect to see if our hypothesis were true. And his hypothesis is that of blind, pitiless indifference, which is a shorthand way of saying that everything came about by strictly undirected material processes.
So I think I might have predicted what he's going to do here. How do you come up with a God hypothesis? I guess that was the name of his book, The God Hypothesis. But yeah, you have to assume the mind of God to do that.
And what the materialists expected coming into the early 20th century was evidence of an eternal, self-existent universe, one that had been here for an infinitely long time and therefore did not need an external creator. What in fact the astrophysicists, the cosmologists, the astronomers found was evidence of a universe that had a definite beginning, and therefore one that could not have created itself because before the matter of the universe came into existence, there was no matter there to do the causing.
Yeah, so that doesn't imply that the universe is created. A universe having a beginning point in time doesn't mean that before we have a universe with time, we don't have a universe, right? So the way I've run this by some physicists to make sure that my argument isn't stupid. And they've said, oh, no, yeah, that works. So good for me. This is how I usually talk about this with the Big Bang. First of all, you got to say, I don't know if the universe was or was not created, and I don't make a claim about it. Because normally what you have to deal with is people saying the universe came from nothing or something like that. I don't believe that. No scientist really thinks that. But anyways, so like what we know about the properties of black holes, right? As you get closer and closer to that event horizon, time slows down and effectively stops. Now, we don't know what's going on inside that event horizon, but that seems to be the explanation for like time or whatever. So if we can have real, well, we don't know if true singularities can exist, but if we can have this black hole area, if we can have regions of space where we have like within there, we wouldn't say that isn't the universe, like it's part of the universe, but where time becomes almost completely irrelevant, or whatever's going on there we just don't yet understand, which is equally good. We can know that we can have parts and places in our universe, properties and conditions can be such where the concept of time either breaks down, time as we understand it just doesn't exist there, or whatever. Now, take the Big Bang and compress everything that we see in our universe into this absurd state. And the concept of time as we know it ceases to exist. But does the universe cease to exist? Now, I think physicists call these like past eternal models, where you have a timeless universe, which is basically eternal, which doesn't mean that this isn't infinite regression and this isn't an infinite amount of time backwards or anything like that. People say that entropy is a real thing, so the universe can't have always existed because it would be decayed by now or by any point. And fair enough. But in a universe before the Big Bang expansion, when whatever was going on, whether it was just fields or just a wave function or some like whatever, I don't know. But in a universe in a state where again, time as we understand it is irrelevant, then it doesn't need to be created. The universe can just exist. Now, that's not satisfying for an answer, but I don't see any logical problem with it. And I certainly don't fully understand what that means. But again, the alternative is this God thing, which is completely unintelligible. So don't let people cry that your explanation doesn't make any sense. Neither does theirs. Like, we know what you mean by God, kind of, but you don't actually understand it. So it's not a good explanation for anything.
And so the picture of the universe that has emerged.
The other problem with a God, is that an infinite God that can do anything explains nothing in particular, because a God could have created anything in any fashion it so desires, which means we have no reason to think that this is that type of, this is what kind of creation a God would want to make.
Starting from the 1920s all the way to the present, both from observational astronomy and from theoretical physics, is a universe that had a definite beginning and therefore requires some sort of external creator or cause.
No. Why can't it be internal? Why can't perturbations or fluctuations in the state of whatever the universe was before that not initiate the expansion of that universe? So this is like I guess this is a first mover argument or whatever, which is just special pleading. You need a God, which is outside of time, space, or whatever, that actualizes every potential or whatever instantly, or whatever that dumb argument was. So because this thing needs to be initiated into a state of evolving conditions and affairs, it needs something that doesn't do that to get it going. And it's like, okay, then what about the thing that made that thing do it? Well, it doesn't apply. Okay, then I claim it doesn't apply to the universe, and you can't do anything. There's no argument against that, not really.
Dawkins is obviously one of the world's most famous atheists. Are you a believer in God yourself?
I do believe in God, yes.
Okay, so let's play a clip from Dawkins on this show. So why is it not possible that there is a superior being, power, which many people believe in different ways?
It's possible there are
different
fairies
types
at the bottom of the garden. I mean, all sorts of things are possible. You can't deny that.
Well, except I've never seen fairies in the garden. Have you?
No, you've never seen God either.
No, but you don't know for sure that either doesn't exist.
No, I don't know that fairies don't exist. Fairies may be leprechauns, for all I know.
You know, my big question for all atheists, is, okay, you don't believe in God, but what was there before the Big Bang, before this all started? In other words, what was there before supposedly nothing? What is nothing? Nothing to me seems to be a totally incongruous
Straw man, but whatever.
word. What is nothingness? And if you can't explain it, to me, and I believe in God, but to me, it suggests there must be a power bigger than the human mind at the start of all this that was able to comprehend what may have happened, because we can't.
Right. Dawkins wants to portray theistic belief as if it's equivalent to belief in fairies. And
It is. It absolutely is, because you can't disprove them.
and he'll concede that, well, it's possible. But I think there's a stronger argument for the theistic case. And that is that when scientists and philosophers reason from evidence, they typically use a method of reasoning that has a technical name. It's called inferring to the best explanation, where the best explanation is one where you're invoking a cause which has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest. And
Wow, that's not true at all. I'm pretty sure he has a PhD in the philosophy of science. An inference to the best explanation, that's just merely the logical steps that get you to like picking a hypothesis or an explanation that best explains the data. So you would invoke things like Occam's razor and Bayesian reasoning and priors and credence in order to make the inference to the best explanation. What Meyer said, and I have to believe that he's just telling a strategic lie. What he said is to invoke something which has the necessary properties to accomplish that task. I need to hear him say it again.
has the kind of powers that would be required to explain the phenomenon of interest.
Right, the kind of powers to explain. So that's just such a insane lie. Because obviously God has the power to do anything. So God is the inference to the best explanation. This isn't exactly what Dawkins was talking about. But you could go down the same avenue and say, yeah, the Spanky here has all of those powers. Therefore, Spanky is the inference to the best explanation. This gets you absolutely nowhere. This solves no problems. You can imagine the most powerful wizard in all of Middle Earth could have created life and the universe. Why not? Any kind of god or any types of many gods working together could explain this. If you're going to say that something just has to have the necessary powers or abilities to do it, and that's a good explanation, that leads you with an infinite number of possibilities. So it actually helps us in no way whatsoever.
And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him that when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the phenomenon of interest. And you correctly pointed out in your conversation with him.
There's no matter, but matter can be transformed into energy and all these things. Like it could perhaps, again, be like, just be a quantum field or something like that. This just once again sounds like arguing from nothing but incredulity and ignorance. We don't know how matter could have done it, therefore God, because God has the power to do it, because God can do anything. So can any God.
That when you get back to that, what physicists often call the singularity, the point where matter, space, time, and energy begin to exist, the materialist is really up against a huge conundrum, because prior to the origin of matter, there is no matter to do the causing. That's what we mean by the origin of matter, that's where it starts.
Right.
And so if you want to invoke a cause which is sufficient to explain the origin of matter, you can't invoke matter. It's in principle, the materialistic explanations are in principle insufficient. So you need to invoke something which is external to the material universe and is not.
No, you don't need to do that at all. Again, if it's not matter, it could be something else. I talk about something I read about for my book when I was doing research on this, like what initiated the Big Bang. Something about like virtual particles popping into existence in sort of a random way where it seems almost uncaused. Perhaps that created the initial conditions that produced matter and antimatter, and that caused the universe to just not literally explode, but kind of explode in a way, or whatever. Like, I'm not telling you that that's the answer, but we're working on it. And to say God did it is
not
just
bounded by time
lazy.
and space as well. And that starts to paint a picture of the kind of cause you would need that has the sort of attributes the traditional theists traditionally associated with God. God is a timeless, God is outside of time and space, has causal powers, is an agent with volition, and
those are not traditional views. If you've ever read the Old Testament, God clearly is a corporeal being that walks around and does things. I don't remember if it's Abraham or Noah, but they literally wash his feet. They make meals for God. God walks around in the garden. In other times, God is like smoke or whatever. So no, these are not traditionalist views. This all came about only in the last couple centuries because of really stupid arguments of my dad could beat up your dad that different religious people were having. And then eventually, to win the argument, people just said, yeah, well, my God is the ultimate being. It's omnipotent, it's omniscient, which, again, if you actually read the Bible, God clearly isn't either of those things. And that my God is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Those things have just been invoked because they are written nowhere. And the only reason they say, like, oh, but logically this is what God is. No, you're just defining God to be that way because you think God has to be that way. And the only reason you think that is because of how much we know about science that makes your God unnecessary to explain everything. Traditionalist views were God is responsible for absolutely everything. And now people claim they still believe that, but they don't really but they don't really, because nobody thinks a miracle happens every time it rains. Well, actually, a lot of people sadly do, but nobody who's really honest, like Stephen Meyer, wouldn't think that cloud formation is miraculous, or or anything like that. So again, traditional views where every single thing that happens is like thanks to God. And we were deeply ignorant, and people didn't really try to understand nature very much, because how could you understand what a God does? But then eventually, extremely slowly, attitudes changed and people started to figure out that nature actually is intelligible, which I would actually argue doesn't make a lot of sense if theism is true. Perhaps if deism is true, yeah, but not really theism. And so, like I was saying, because God hasn't been necessary to explain anything in particular, you have to invoke this omni-God to try to explain why existence even is a thing, or why a universe exists. And so now the God, because he can't be bound by natural powers or whatever, but nature explains basically everything we've ever seen, except for what happens inside event horizons and what was going on in the first couple Planck seconds of the universe. That's where your God goes. That is your God of the gaps.
Therefore can initiate a change of state from, in this case, nothing to something.
And do you believe that God created this original single cell from which everything flows to us?
Oh, the single cell as opposed to the universe.
Well, I guess you go back to the universe,
Yeah,
and then you go back to the creation of a single cell that has this incredible complexity that eventually, through the process of evolution, leads to human beings.
Yeah, I do think
do you believe that's really the most likely scenario?
Yeah, I do think there's incredible evidence of intelligent design at the point of the origin of life, because that first simple cell.
See, again, he doesn't believe what he's saying. He doesn't believe all of what he's saying, because he believes all life was spontaneously created. So instead, he's going to say, they do this because everybody knows that science is very persuasive, and scientific reasoning is extremely persuasive. I don't know what else to call it. So in order to not sound goofy, he's not going to invoke that God created man and dinosaur side by side and they lived happily together in the Garden of Eden until some dumb broad ate an apple. Instead, he's going to say, he's actually arguing like a deist, kind of, in a way, like, well, you need a God to do the initial thing, but then things play out, which he doesn't believe, but that's the story he's telling you.
19th century Thomas Huxley said that the cell is a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm.
Brilliant phrase.
Wonderful. He was one of the great scientists of the 19th century, but we know so much more now that he didn't know. And what we now know is that inside even the simplest cell, we have digital nanotechnology. We have the information stored in the DNA. We have an exquisite system of information storage, transmission, and processing. And that information is being used to build protein machines and other even more complex nanomachinery inside the cell. So it's a sort of automated factory run by digital information. People didn't know about that in the early 19th century.
But do you believe, like I said, originally there's just one single solitary cell that's created?
Well, right. Presumably that's where.
Is that what you think?
I do think there was an original cell that was created.
Because the theory.
No, you do not believe that. Oh, he's just such a liar. He's a young Earth creationist. He does not believe that. Maybe he's doing the politician lawyer speak where it's like, well, I answered the question directly, but I wasn't. Like he can always say, oh, well, but I also believe these other things, but he just asked me if I believe in the cell thing, and I believe that as well.
Evolution says the journey from single cell to the full complexity of life on Earth and so on happened by random trial and error. But
it's not fucking random trial and error. Nature does not operate according to random laws. None of it is like there are things that are fundamentally like unpredictable, if that's what we mean by random. And there can be things that are truly random that have really no antecedent. The only example I can think of off the top of my head seems to be like radioactive decay. Like which neutron in the nucleus spontaneously converts into a proton or vice versa. That seems to have nothing to do with, which one converted before. But, evolution and natural selection, it isn't random. It says selection, and it's not random selection.
Your position, I think, is that it's so complicated, this original single cell, so complex for all the reasons you just articulated, that that's just simply not feasible, that it would be just random trial and error. It had to be the creation of some superior entity.
Right.
Is that right?
Well, again, there's two contexts. There's the how do you get to the first cell, and then how do you get from the first cell to everything else. Let's just take the origin of the
So
first cell.
you think the creator of the universe is God?
I do.
And then out of the universe comes the creation of a single cell, which again is God.
We are not going to be able to do this whole
Here's
video.
the evidence, though. That when we see information in a digital or alphabetic or typographic form, and this is what we actually see in the DNA.
It always
when
comes
Francis
from a
Crick
mind.
elucidated what he called the sequence hypothesis in the late 1950s, he realized that the 4 subunits along the interior of the DNA are functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text or digital characters in a section of software. What we know from experience is that whenever we say information of that sort, it always comes from a mind. Bill Gates, our local hero, has said that DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever devised. Richard Dawkins has acknowledged that it functions like a machine code. Well, what we know is that software comes from a programmer. And in fact, whenever we see information of that kind, whether it's in a software program or hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book.
What I usually say to this is this isn't unique to DNA. You could ask a few different questions. Is DNA and all the mechanisms behind them, are they anything other than chemicals? And they're obviously not. And they'll admit that sometimes they'll admit it. I've even gotten Angel to admit this. And then you say, okay, so those chemicals they're just interacting with each other according to like the laws of physics, I guess, or like according to like the laws of chemistry, which it's chemical reactions happen because the matter is always trying to reach like a lower energy state, right? That's why if you mix copper chloride with aluminum, the copper or the chlorine has a higher affinity to that aluminum because it's like a preferable bond or whatever. So the aluminum will take the place of the copper. DNA it's far more complex because it has far more moving parts, but it isn't doing anything different than that. Now you could argue that life in general does not just tend towards disorder. Life in general doesn't. It acts against entropy, and that's true, but that's only possible because there's a constant supply of energy, first in the form of photons, and then in the form of producers create organic matter, and then consumers consume it in order to do things. But anyways, the point is he's acting like DNA does something completely unique, and it absolutely does not. If you want to say like this, the code or the activity or whatever that's doing, I could imply that literally I could do that in the simplest form. I could just say the configuration of valence electrons in an atom is going to tell you its chemical properties, and it's going to predict, or it'll determine what sorts of things that atom or element or chemical will do. But do we think the configuration of valence electrons is a code? Well, if you press them on this, a lot of times they say that, but they never come up with that idea on their own. It's only after you press them on it. So without rambling too much, the main point is DNA is a molecule. It's made of matter. It's doing the exact same thing that all these other forms of matter that you are not claiming are codes are doing. So we don't have something new here. We do have something more complex, and you could say like maybe something unique has emerged from this, but it's all a bottom-up thing. No miracle is taking place. It's not like these forms of matter can only do these certain things, and only by miraculous intervention can a collection of atoms that forms a DNA molecule do anything. No.
It always arises from a mind, not a material process. So the discovery of information at the foundation of life, and even the simplest living cell, I argue, is decisive evidence of the activity of a designing mind in the origin of life.
What is the Goldilocks zone? Another of your big bedrocks of your book.
Well, this is something.
Oh, he actually thinks that there's a Goldilocks zone? What a dumbass.
That's one way that the physicists refer to something that they call the fine-tuning of the universe, or sometimes they talk about it, the anthropic fine-tuning. The idea is that the most fundamental parameter.
Okay, you know what? I am going to do a part 2 on this, but I've been recording for an hour and 10 minutes. And I don't know, like a lot of people like Professor Dave and Gutsick Gibbon or whatever, I mean, they'll do like 2-3 hour videos. I'm not doing that. So we're gonna end it there because this is actually we're really on different topics now. So stay tuned, I guess. Thanks for watching.